Sometimes the greatest mercy we can show is learning when to let go. The rain hammered the windshield of Dr. Marcus Whitmore's pickup truck as he navigated the winding mountain roads outside Grants Pass, Oregon. After 30 years as a veterinarian, he'd seen enough suffering to know that some wounds never heal, especially the ones we inflict on ourselves. The abandoned Blackwood Research Facility loomed ahead through the storm, its broken windows staring like dead eyes into the November darkness. Marcus had spent the last 3 years drowning in guilt over Sarah's death, replaying every moment of that terrible night when he'd failed to save her dog, Bella. The surgery should have been routine. Instead, his trembling hands had cost him everything: his daughter's trust, her life in a car accident that followed their fight, and his faith in his own abilities. But tonight, something impossible waited by the facility's rusted gates. A figure hunched in the rain, crying with a sound that pierced through the storm like a knife through his heart. As his headlights swept across the creature, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The crying form had the torso of a woman, but the head and limbs of a German shepherd, exactly like his daughter's beloved Bella. What had Dr. Helena Cross been doing in this place, and why did this creature's eyes look so achingly familiar? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus sat frozen behind the wheel, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge. The creature, he couldn't bring himself to think of it as anything else, remained motionless by the gates, its shoulders shaking with each sob that somehow cut through the storm's fury. 3 years of sleepless nights had prepared him for hallucinations. Dr. Reeves had warned him that grief could manifest in unexpected ways, that the mind sometimes conjured what the heart desperately needed to see. But this felt different. The creature's cries weren't the phantom sounds that had haunted his empty house. They were raw, desperate, and utterly real. Marcus fumbled for his phone, muscle memory taking over. 911. He should call someone. Animal control, maybe, though what would he say? That he'd found something that belonged in a nightmare, not in the forests of Oregon. His finger hovered over the screen as another wave of sobs reached him. The sound triggered a memory so vivid it stole his breath. Sarah, at age 7, crying in the barn after finding their cat Luna with a broken wing. That same heartbroken keening, the way her small shoulders had shaken with the weight of witnessing suffering she couldn't fix. He'd knelt beside her then, explaining that sometimes helping meant more than healing. Sometimes it meant having the courage to ease pain when healing wasn't possible. But I don't want Luna to hurt anymore, Daddy. I know, sweetheart. Neither do I. The memory dissolved as the creature's head turned toward his truck. Even through the rain-streaked windshield and the distance between them, those eyes hit him like a physical blow. Brown, flecked with gold. Intelligent. Pleading. Bella's eyes. Marcus's hand shook as he reached for the door handle. 30 years of veterinary experience had taught him to approach unknown animals with caution, but every instinct screamed that this was something beyond his training, something that defied every natural law he understood. The rain soaked through his jacket the moment he stepped outside, the November cold biting through to his bones. The creature, female, definitely female, watched his approach with an alertness that made his skin crawl. Not the wary intelligence of a frightened animal, but something deeper, something that recognized him. "Easy," he murmured, the words coming automatically despite the impossibility of the situation. "I'm not going to hurt you." She, it felt wrong to think it now, tilted her head at his voice. The gesture was so achingly familiar that Marcus had to steady himself against his truck. Bella had done that same head tilt whenever Sarah spoke to her, that perfect blend of attention and affection that had made their German shepherd so special. The creature rose to her feet with fluid grace, standing nearly 6 feet tall. Her torso was undeniably human, pale skin marred by what looked like surgical scars across her chest and arms. But her head was purely canine, German shepherd features perfectly formed, yet somehow expressive, in ways that transcended species. Her hands, though tipped with claws, possessed an opposable thumb that she used to gesture toward the facility's entrance. "Follow me." The message was clear despite the lack of words. Marcus glanced at the facility looming behind her. Blackwood Research had been shuttered for 5 years, victim of funding cuts and what the local papers had diplomatically called ethical concerns. He'd driven past it countless times during his house calls to the rural properties scattered throughout these mountains, never giving it much thought. Just another abandoned building slowly being reclaimed by the Oregon wilderness. But Dr. Helena Cross had worked here. His mentor, the woman who'd taught him surgical techniques that had revolutionized his practice. The woman who'd vanished 3 years ago, just weeks after Sarah's funeral, leaving behind only questions and a research lab that had been sealed by federal investigators. The creature gestured again, more urgently this time. Rain ran in rivulets down her fur, and those 2 familiar eyes held a desperation that made Marcus's chest tight. Whatever she wanted him to see, it was important enough to brave this storm, important enough to approach a human despite what had clearly been done to her. Some wounds never heal, especially the ones we inflict on ourselves. The words echoed in Marcus's mind as he took his first step toward the gates. He should turn around, drive home to his empty house, pour another glass of whiskey, and pretend this was just another grief-induced hallucination. But those eyes wouldn't let him. The familiarity in them, the pain that mirrored his own, it pulled him forward despite every rational thought screaming warnings. The creature turned and began walking toward the facility's main entrance, pausing every few steps to ensure he was following. Her gait was neither fully human nor entirely animal, but something caught between worlds, something that shouldn't exist. Marcus followed anyway, his veterinarian's bag clutched in one hand, flashlight in the other. Whatever waited inside Blackwood Research, whatever Dr. Cross had been working on in those final months, he was about to discover that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The creature's cries had stopped, but somehow the silence was even worse. The silence stretched between them as they approached the facility's entrance, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against metal and concrete. Marcus's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rusted chains that had once secured the main doors, chains that now lay severed on the ground, their edges still gleaming with fresh metal. As if sensing his hesitation, the creature turned back toward him. In the harsh LED light, her features were even more unsettling, too human to dismiss as animal, too canine to accept as natural. But it was the intelligence in those golden brown eyes that made his stomach clench. The way she looked at him held recognition, a familiarity that reached past the impossibility of her existence. This is insane, Marcus thought, even as his feet carried him forward. I'm following some kind of hybrid abomination into an abandoned research facility in the middle of a storm. Reeves would have me committed. The thought of his therapist triggered another cascade of memories. 3 years' worth of sessions, of being told that guilt was a normal part of the grieving process, that survivor's remorse would fade with time. Dr. Reeves didn't know about the unopened letters from the veterinary board, the ones asking for his techniques to be peer-reviewed for potential inclusion in surgical textbooks. Marcus had shoved them into a drawer after Sarah's funeral and never looked back. Your surgical innovations could save thousands of animals, Marcus, Dr. Cross had told him during their last conversation. Don't let personal tragedy stop you from sharing your gifts with the world. Helena had always pushed him toward greatness, even when he'd been content with his small-town practice. It was her influence that had led to his breakthrough techniques, her guidance that had made him one of the most sought-after veterinary surgeons on the West Coast, before Sarah's accident, before Bella, before everything fell apart. The creature, he still couldn't bring himself to think of her any other way, pushed through the facility's entrance with surprising strength. The heavy steel door groaned on its hinges, revealing a corridor that stretched into absolute darkness. The air that escaped was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something clinical that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his own operating room. She gestured again, more insistently, and Marcus found himself thinking of Sarah's impatience whenever he'd moved too slowly during their weekend hiking trips. "Come on, Dad. The waterfall won't wait forever." His daughter had always been eager to push forward, to discover what lay around the next bend. It had been one of the things he'd loved most about her, that fearless curiosity that made every day an adventure. The memory stung worse than the rain that continued to soak through his clothes. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, but moments like this made her absence feel fresh, a wound that refused to properly heal. The house had been too quiet since her death, too empty. Even Bella's presence had become a constant reminder of what he'd lost, until he'd lost her too. Not focus, he told himself. Whatever this is, whatever this creature wants to show you, Sarah isn't coming back. But as he followed the hybrid deeper into the facility, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, impossibly, this was connected to his daughter. The way the creature moved, the familiar tilt of her head, even the urgency in her gestures, it all felt like an echo of someone he'd once known. The corridor branched off in multiple directions, but the creature chose her path without hesitation, leading him past abandoned laboratories and offices where equipment sat shrouded in dust and shadow. Water dripped from damaged ceiling tiles, creating a symphony of soft percussion that made every footstep seem unnaturally loud. Marcus's flashlight beam swept across broken glass and overturned furniture, revealing signs of a hasty evacuation. Papers scattered across the floor, computer monitors dark and cracked, chairs pushed back as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-task. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been orderly. The creature paused at an intersection, turning to ensure he was still following. In the brief moment their eyes met, Marcus saw something that made his breath catch. Not just intelligence, but recognition. She knew him. Not just as a human who'd stopped to help, but as someone specific, someone important. Impossible, he told himself, but the certainty was growing stronger with each step. This creature, this hybrid that shouldn't exist, was trying to tell him something, show him something that connected to his past, to the guilt that had been eating away at him for 3 years. They descended a staircase that led into the facility's lower levels, where the smell of decay grew stronger and the walls seemed to close in around them. The creature's breathing had grown labored, and Marcus realized she was struggling with each step, as if the very act of bringing him here was costing her more than she could afford. She pressed on, driven by the same desperate urgency that had brought her to him in the storm. Whatever lay ahead in the darkness, she needed him to see it. Marcus followed, his grip tightening on the flashlight as they descended deeper into whatever hell Blackwood Research had become. The staircase ended at a heavy metal door marked with biohazard symbols that had faded but not disappeared entirely. The creature's clawed hand hesitated on the handle, and for the first time since he'd encountered her, Marcus saw something like fear cross her features. Her breathing had become shallow, rapid, the kind of distressed panting he'd seen in countless animals facing surgery or euthanasia. "What's in there?" he whispered, though he knew she couldn't answer. The question escaped anyway, a veterinarian's instinct to comfort a frightened patient overriding the impossibility of the situation. She turned those golden-brown eyes toward him again, and Marcus felt his world shift on its axis. The expression in them wasn't animal fear, it was human grief, raw, devastating sorrow mixed with something that looked almost like hope. As if his presence here meant something, as if he could somehow fix whatever lay beyond that door. The handle turned with a grinding screech of metal on metal. The smell hit him immediately. Formaldehyde mixed with decay, the sterile antiseptic tang of a laboratory overlaid with the sweet stench of death. Marcus had encountered it countless times in his practice, but never quite like this. Never so concentrated, so overwhelming. His flashlight beam swept across what had once been a research laboratory, but the scene that greeted him made his knees buckle. Rows upon rows of cages lined the walls, industrial-sized kennels that stretched from floor to ceiling, and in every single one lay the remains of dogs. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, his veterinarian's bag slipping from numb fingers. German shepherds, golden retrievers, Labradors, mixed breeds. dozens of them in various stages of decomposition. But it wasn't just the number that made his stomach lurch. It was the surgical scars. Precise incision lines across skulls and spines, chest cavities opened and closed with the kind of surgical precision he'd spent decades perfecting. His techniques, his innovations, used for this. The creature beside him had begun making soft whimpering sounds, the same heartbroken cries that had drawn him from the storm. She moved between the cages with a familiarity that spoke of countless visits, pausing at each one as if paying respects to old friends. Marcus forced himself to look closer, his medical training warring with his revulsion. The surgical work was flawless. Whoever had operated on these animals possessed skills that rivaled his own. The bone work in particular showed a mastery of veterinary neurosurgery that he'd seen in only one other person. "Helena," he whispered, and the creature's head snapped toward him at the sound of the name. Dr. Helena Cross, his mentor, his colleague, the woman who'd vanished 3 years ago after Sarah's funeral. She'd been asking about his techniques in those final weeks, particularly his breakthrough methods in spinal and cranial surgery. Research purposes, she'd said. Academic collaboration. He'd been too consumed with grief to question why she needed such detailed information about procedures she'd helped him develop. But this was beyond research. This was systematic experimentation on a scale that defied comprehension, and every cut, every suture, every precisely placed incision bore the hallmarks of surgical methods that were uniquely his own. The creature approached one cage in particular, placing her clawed hand against the wire mesh. Inside lay the remains of a German shepherd, and even in death, Marcus could see the careful surgical modifications. Implants at the base of the skull, bone grafts along the spine, tissue work around what appeared to be a hybridization attempt. The realization hit him like a physical blow. These weren't just experiments. They were failures. Failed attempts at whatever process had created the creature standing beside him, the only survivor in a laboratory full of the dead. Marcus's hands shook as he reached for his phone, some distant part of his mind insisting he needed to document this, call authorities, do something. But the creature's clawed hand closed gently over his wrist, stopping him. When he looked into her eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. "Please," they seemed to say. "Not yet. There's more." She gestured toward the back of the laboratory where another door stood ajar. Through the gap, Marcus could see what looked like an operating theater. Surgical lights dark but still hanging in position. An operating table stained with substances he didn't want to identify. This was his choice point. He could turn around now, leave this nightmare behind, call the police from the safety of his truck and let them sort through whatever Helena Cross had been doing in her final months at Blackwood. He could pretend he'd never seen the impossible creature weeping by the roadside, never followed her into this charnel house of failed experiments. Or he could continue deeper into the facility, past the point of plausible deniability, and confront whatever truth waited in that operating theater. The creature watched him with those heartbreakingly familiar eyes, and Marcus realized that whatever he discovered next would change everything. His ordinary world was already gone, shattered the moment he'd chosen to follow her into the darkness. The only question now was how much truth he could bear to face. Marcus stood frozen at the threshold, his flashlight beam trembling as it played across the operating theater beyond. The surgical table dominated the center of the room like an altar to some obscene god, its surface stained with dark patches that caught the light with a wet sheen. Above it, surgical lights hung at precise angles, the same configuration he used in his own clinic. Turn around, every rational part of his mind screamed. Leave now, while you still can. But his feet remained rooted to the concrete floor, weighted down by a growing dread that had nothing to do with the horrors he'd already witnessed. The creature beside him waited with infinite patience, her golden brown eyes reflecting his flashlight beam. She wasn't pushing him forward anymore. She understood that this decision had to be his alone. "I can't," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't see any more of this." The admission tasted like acid in his mouth. 30 years of veterinary practice, countless surgeries, life and death decisions made in sterile rooms just like this one, and he was paralyzed by fear. Not fear of what he might see, but fear of what it might mean, what it might say about him, about the techniques he'd pioneered, about the legacy he'd thought he was building. His surgical innovations had been supposed to save lives, to push the boundaries of veterinary medicine in service of healing. The papers he'd published, the techniques Helena had helped him develop, they were meant to be his gift to the world. Sarah had been so proud when the veterinary journals started calling him a pioneer, when colleagues began traveling from across the country to observe his procedures. "My dad's the best surgeon in Oregon," she'd told anyone who would listen. "He can fix anything." Except he couldn't. When it mattered most, when Bella lay dying on his own operating table, when Sarah's tear-streaked face looked to him for a miracle he didn't possess, he'd failed. And now, looking at this nightmare laboratory filled with the fruits of his surgical genius, he wondered if he'd been failing all along without knowing it. The creature made a soft sound, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh. When Marcus looked at her, he saw understanding in those two familiar eyes. She knew what he was feeling, the weight of responsibility, the crushing awareness that good intentions could pave roads to unimaginable horror. "Helena did this," Marcus said, needing to hear the words aloud. "She used my methods, my techniques, everything I taught her, everything we developed together. She used it to create—" He gestured helplessly at the creature beside him. "To create you." The confirmation sent ice through his veins. His life's work perverted into something monstrous. Every innovation he'd pioneered, every surgical breakthrough that had saved countless animals, Helena had weaponized them all. The bone work, the neural interfaces, the tissue grafting techniques that had made him famous in veterinary circles, they were all here, twisted into something that defied nature itself. But worse than that was the nagging certainty that he should have known. Helena's questions in those final weeks before Sarah's death had been too specific, too focused. Her requests for his surgical notes, her interest in his spinal cord procedures, the way she'd pushed him to document his innovations for posterity. How had he missed the signs? "Because you were drowning in grief," a voice whispered in his mind. "Because you were too broken to see anything beyond your own pain." Marcus closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his eyelids was filled with Sarah's face. The way she'd looked at him in the veterinary clinic that awful day, trust and desperation warring in her expression, as Bella fought for life on his operating table. The surgical complications that had cascaded beyond his control, the moment when he'd realized that all his skill, all his innovation, wasn't enough to save the dog his daughter loved more than anything in the world. "You did everything you could, Dad." But had he? Or had his very techniques, the same ones now revealed to be capable of such abomination, been flawed from the beginning? Had he been playing God without understanding the true cost of his ambition? The creature's clawed hand touched his arm gently, almost tenderly. The gesture was so human, so filled with compassion, that Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. Whatever she was, however she'd been created, she was trying to comfort him. This hybrid abomination born from his surgical legacy was showing him more kindness than he'd shown himself in 3 years. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What am I supposed to do with this?" She gestured again toward the operating theater, but this time Marcus saw something different in her eyes. Not just urgency, but recognition, as if the answer to his question lay beyond that threshold, in whatever final revelation waited in that chamber of horrors. The truth he'd been running from for 3 years was in that room. Marcus could feel it like a physical presence, dense and suffocating. Whatever Helena had done here, whoever this creature really was, it was connected to everything, to Sarah, to Bella, to the guilt that had been eating him alive since that terrible day. He could still turn back. He could still preserve what remained of his shattered illusions. But the creature's eyes held such desperate hope, such heartbreaking faith in his ability to understand, to accept, to somehow make this right. Marcus took a trembling step toward the operating theater, then stopped. His courage failed him completely, leaving him suspended between revelation and denial, knowing that whatever came next would destroy the last remnants of the man he used to be. The moment stretched like a held breath, Marcus caught between retreat and revelation. Rain hammered against the facility above them, a distant percussion that seemed to echo his thundering heartbeat. The creature's golden brown eyes never wavered from his face, and in their depths, he saw something that finally broke through his paralysis. Not just hope, but love. Pure, desperate love that transcended species, transcended the horror of what she'd become. "Okay," Marcus whispered, the word torn from his throat. "Okay." He stepped forward into the operating theater, crossing the threshold that separated his old life from whatever lay ahead. The moment his foot touched the stained concrete floor, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. The safety of ignorance, of plausible deniability, of being able to walk away from this nightmare. It all vanished like morning mist. There was no going back now. The surgical lights clicked on automatically, triggered by motion sensors that had somehow survived the facility's abandonment. Marcus flinched as harsh fluorescent glare flooded the room, revealing details that the flashlight beam had mercifully hidden. The operating table wasn't just stained, it was scored with deep gouges, as if something with claws had thrashed against the restraints. Surgical instruments lay scattered across counter surfaces, their steel surfaces dulled with substances he refused to identify. But it was the walls that made his knees buckle. Charts, hundreds of them. Detailed surgical diagrams showing hybrid anatomy, step-by-step procedures for neural grafting, bone extension protocols, tissue integration techniques, and in the corner, a photo collage that made his vision blur with tears, pictures of dogs. Bella prominently featured among them, her golden coat captured in dozens of images from every angle, her skull structure analyzed with the cold precision of a scientific specimen. "No," Marcus breathed, but the evidence was undeniable. Helena had been watching, studying, planning this for months before Bella's surgery, before that terrible day when everything fell apart. The accidental complications that had led to his beloved patient's death, they hadn't been accidents at all. The creature moved beside him, her breathing labored and pained. She approached a cabinet filled with surgical records, her clawed hand trembling as she pulled out a thick folder. Inside were X-rays, preoperative photos, detailed surgical notes written in Helena's precise handwriting. But the patient name at the top made Marcus's world tilt sideways. Subject 23A, Bella, pre-surgical assessment, golden retriever, 4 years old, excellent bone density for integration procedures, emotional attachment factor, critical for psychological compliance of primary subject. Marcus sank to his knees as the truth crashed over him. Bella's death hadn't been his failure as a surgeon. It had been orchestrated. Helena had sabotaged the surgery, killed his daughter's beloved dog, shattered both their hearts, all as preparation for something larger. Something that required Sarah to be vulnerable, broken, trusting enough to accept help from someone she loved. The creature knelt beside him, her hybrid form awkward but determined. She pressed another folder into his hands with shaking claws. This one was labeled simply, Subject 24, Sarah. Inside were photos that made Marcus retch, his daughter unconscious on this very table, surgical sites marked across her skull and spine, notations about bone density and tissue compatibility. The dates showed the procedures had begun just days after her supposed death in the car accident. The accident that Helena had insisted on handling alone, claiming she wanted to spare him the trauma of examining Sarah's body. The damage was too extensive, Helena had told him at the funeral. "Trust me, Marcus. You don't want to see her like that. Remember her as she was." But Sarah hadn't died in that car accident. Helena had taken her, brought her here, and used Marcus's own surgical innovations to transform her into the creature now kneeling beside him. The daughter he'd mourned, the child he'd buried with a closed casket, had been suffering in this laboratory for 3 years. Sarah. The name escaped as barely a whisper. The creature, his daughter, let out a sound that was half sob, half whimper. When she looked at him, Marcus saw past the canine features, past the golden fur and elongated skull. He saw the familiar tilt of her head, the gesture she'd made as a child when she was trying to be brave but desperately needed comfort. He saw the daughter, who used to crawl into his lap after nightmares, who'd helped him in the clinic after school, who'd believed with absolute faith that her father could fix anything. "Oh my God," Marcus choked out. "Sarah, what did she do to you?" His daughter couldn't answer. Whatever Helena's procedures had accomplished, they'd stolen Sarah's voice along with her humanity. But she pressed close to him, her hybrid form trembling with the same need for comfort she'd shown as a child. Despite everything she'd become, despite the horror of her transformation, she was still his daughter. Still the little girl who'd trusted him to keep her safe, and he'd failed her. Helena had taken that trust, weaponized it, used it to destroy everything Marcus had ever loved. But Sarah was alive, changed, traumatized, trapped in a form that defied nature, but alive, and she'd brought him here for a reason. There was no going back to his old life, no pretending this nightmare didn't exist. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. The weight of revelation pressed down on Marcus like a physical force as he knelt beside his transformed daughter. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to deny what his eyes confirmed. But Sarah's clawed hand rested trustingly in his, anchoring him to this impossible reality. The surgical lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the operating theater feel like a scene from hell. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the facility, metal clanging against concrete, followed by the unmistakable splash of footsteps through standing water. Marcus froze, his grip tightening on Sarah's hand. She heard it too, her canine ears swiveling toward the source as a low growl rumbled in her throat. "We're not alone," Marcus whispered. Sarah's response was immediate and terrifying. She positioned herself between Marcus and the doorway, her hybrid form coiled with predatory tension. The gentle creature who had sought comfort moments before was gone, replaced by something wild and protective. Her lips pulled back to reveal fangs that gleamed under the surgical lights. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a voice that made Marcus's blood turn to ice. "Subject 24. Are you down here again?" Dr. Helena Cross emerged from the corridor beyond, her silver hair tied back in the same pristine bun she'd worn during their years of collaboration. She carried a medical bag and wore surgical scrubs stained with substances Marcus didn't want to identify. When her pale blue eyes fell on him, her expression shifted from mild annoyance to calculating interest. "Well," she said, setting down her bag with deliberate care. "This is unexpected." "Hello, Marcus." "Helena." The name came out as a growl. Marcus struggled to his feet, placing himself beside Sarah. "What have you done?" "I've continued our work." Helena's voice held the same clinical detachment she'd once used to discuss routine procedures. "The techniques you developed were brilliant, but your vision was so limited. Healing broken animals, extending natural lifespans, such small ambitions for revolutionary science." Sarah's growl deepened, but Helena showed no fear. Instead, she reached into her bag and withdrew a device that looked like a modified cattle prod. "Now, 24. You know the rules. No bringing outsiders to the laboratory." Helena's tone was sickeningly maternal. "This complicates things considerably." "Her name is Sarah," Marcus snapped, but Helena's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Sarah died 3 years ago, Marcus. What you see here is something far more remarkable. The first successful human-animal hybrid, combining your surgical innovations with my genetic modifications. She's going to live for centuries, possibly forever. Isn't that what every parent wants for their child?" The device in Helena's hand sparked with electrical current. Sarah flinched backward, and Marcus realized with horror that she'd been conditioned to fear it. How many times had Helena used pain to control his daughter? How many sessions of torture disguised as behavioral modification? "You sick!" Marcus lunged forward, but Helena raised the device warningly. "I wouldn't if I were you." 24 becomes quite agitated when she witnesses violence. The last person who tried to interfere required extensive medical attention. Helena's smile was razor-thin. Though I suppose that wouldn't stop you. You always were protective of your failures. Failures? Bella's death destroyed you. Sarah's supposed death nearly drove you to suicide. You never had the strength for true scientific advancement, Marcus. Always too emotional, too attached to preserve individual specimens when the greater work demanded sacrifice. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a cold clarity cutting through his shock and grief. He understood now why Sarah had led him here. Not just to reveal the truth, but to end this. Helena was still experimenting, still torturing others in the name of her twisted research. Where are the others? He asked. Others? Don't lie to me. Sarah wouldn't be this protective if she were the only one. How many more are there? Helena's expression flickered, the first crack in her clinical composure. The other subjects aren't your concern. Sarah made a sound that was almost like speech, a desperate series of whimpers and growls. She gestured frantically toward another corridor, one Marcus hadn't noticed before. Helena's grip tightened on her weapon. The laboratory tours end here, Marcus. You have two choices: leave now and forget what you've seen, or become part of the research yourself. Your surgical skills would be invaluable, and I've often wondered how well your techniques would translate to human subjects. The threat hung in the air like surgical smoke. Marcus looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Despite the horror of her transformation, despite the trauma written in every line of her hybrid form, she was fighting. She'd survived 3 years of Helena's experiments and still retained enough of herself to seek help, to lead him here. She wasn't just showing him the truth, she was asking him to choose sides. You're right about one thing, Marcus said quietly. I was always too attached, too emotional. He met Helena's cold gaze. I still am. The battle for Sarah's freedom was about to begin. The electrical device crackled in Helena's hand as Marcus calculated distances, angles, possibilities. 30 years of veterinary surgery had trained his hands to be steady under pressure, but those had been controlled environments with anesthetized patients, not life-or-death confrontations with a woman who had weaponized his life's work. Sarah's breathing came in sharp pants beside him, her hybrid form trembling with barely contained energy. Every muscle in her transformed body was coiled for action, but Marcus could see the conditioning Helena had beaten into her, the instinctive flinch whenever the device sparked, the way she held herself just out of range despite her obvious desire to attack. You're thinking about doing something heroic, Helena observed, her clinical tone unchanged despite the tension crackling between them. I can see it in your posture, the way your weight has shifted forward. But you're forgetting that I know you, Marcus. You freeze under pressure. Remember the Pemberton case? The arterial tear during that routine spleen removal? You stood there for 30 seconds while the dog bled out before I had to take over. The memory hit like a physical blow. Helena was right. He had frozen that day, paralyzed by the sight of spurting blood while precious seconds ticked away. It was his greatest professional failure before Bella's death. A moment of hesitation that had cost a life. But something was different now. Looking at Sarah's scarred form, seeing the evidence of 3 years of torture disguised as research, Marcus felt no hesitation. Only a cold, surgical precision that he'd never experienced in any operating theater. The difference, he said quietly, moving half a step closer, is that this time, it's my daughter. Helena's eyes narrowed. 24 isn't your daughter anymore. The neural modifications have altered her brain chemistry significantly, reduced empathy, enhanced aggression, modified pack loyalty behaviors. She's as likely to turn on you as protect you if the situation becomes... Sarah's roar cut through Helena's words, like a scalpel through tissue. The sound was neither fully human nor canine, but something terrible that spoke of rage held too long in check. She launched herself forward with inhuman speed, claws extended toward Helena's throat. The electrical device discharged with a sharp crack. Sarah convulsed mid-leap, crashing to the concrete floor in a heap of spasming limbs. The smell of burned fur filled the air as she lay motionless, her golden eyes rolled back in her skull. No! Marcus dropped to his knees beside her, his hands finding the pulse point on her neck. Her heartbeat was erratic but strong, alive. The relief nearly broke him. You see? Helena stepped closer, the device recharging with a high whine. Completely predictable. The neural modifications make her aggressive, but the conditioning protocols ensure compliance. 3 years of careful behavioral adjustment. You tortured her, Marcus whispered, his fingers tracing the scars that crisscrossed Sarah's skull. I optimized her. The emotional attachments that made her human were inefficient. Pain is simply another tool, Marcus. When properly applied, it shapes behavior more effectively than any pharmaceutical intervention. Marcus looked up at his former mentor, this woman he'd once respected, and felt something fundamental break inside him. Not the shattering devastation he'd experienced after Bella and Sarah's deaths, but a clean, precise fracture that left him crystalline and focused. You're right about my failures, he said, rising slowly to his feet. I was always too emotional, too attached, but that's what you never understood, Helena. The attachment wasn't weakness, it was purpose. Helena raised the device as Marcus took another step forward. Stay where you are. I won't hesitate to use this on you as well. I know you won't. Marcus's voice carried the same calm he used when explaining terminal diagnoses to grieving pet owners. You've moved so far beyond human connection that you can't recognize what you're looking at. And what exactly am I looking at? Behind Helena, in the corridor she'd emerged from, shapes were moving in the shadows, limping, crawling, supporting each other, more of Helena's subjects drawn by Sarah's roar and their creator's raised voice. Marcus could see them gathering, these broken creatures that Helena had dismissed as mere test specimens. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, awareness returning as she registered the approaching forms. You're looking at a father who has nothing left to lose, Marcus said, holding Helena's attention while Sarah slowly, silently, began to rise. And you're surrounded by the children you thought you'd broken. Helena's clinical composure finally cracked as she heard the sounds behind her, growls and whimpers and footsteps that splashed through standing water. When she turned to look, her face went pale. A dozen hybrid creatures filled the corridor, their mismatched forms bearing the surgical scars of Helena's obsession. But their eyes, human eyes in transformed faces, burned with unified purpose. The doctor had become the specimen, and her subjects were ready to begin their own experiment. The device trembled in Helena's grip as her clinical control finally shattered. This is impossible. The behavioral conditioning, the neural suppressants. Her voice rose to a pitch Marcus had never heard from her before, scientific certainty crumbling into desperate denial. The hybrid creatures moved with deliberate patience, their mismatched forms creating a grotesque tableau in the surgical lights. Some bore canine features like Sarah. Others showed feline modifications or stranger combinations that spoke of Helena's escalating madness. A young man with vulpine ears supported a girl whose legs had been replaced with something reptilian. Behind them, more shapes emerged from the shadows. How many subjects had Helena collected over the years? They remember, Marcus said, helping Sarah to her feet. Her golden eyes met his with an intelligence that cut through Helena's lies about neural modification. Damaged, traumatized, but undeniably still his daughter. You couldn't condition away their humanity any more than you could condition away love. Love? Helena's laugh was brittle as breaking glass. You're anthropomorphizing lab specimens. Their behavior is driven by pack loyalty protocols I designed myself. They're responding to dominance displays, nothing more. But even as she spoke, her eyes darted between the advancing creatures and the exits. The woman who had dissected empathy as weakness was confronting something her clinical mind couldn't categorize or control. Sarah stepped forward, her claws clicking against the concrete. When she opened her mouth, sounds emerged, not words, but something close. A pattern of whimpers and growls that the other hybrids responded to immediately. They spread out, cutting off Helena's escape routes with tactical precision that spoke of planning, of communication, of everything Helena claimed she had eliminated. Fascinating, Helena whispered, but her scientific fascination was poisoned by fear. The vocal modifications weren't supposed to allow complex language. How are they coordinating? Marcus felt a surge of pride pierce through his horror. Sarah hadn't just survived. She'd adapted, learned, led. The daughter who had once organized elaborate tea parties for her stuffed animals had found new ways to create community among the broken. Maybe because you were wrong about everything that matters, Marcus said. You saw human connection as a flaw to be corrected, but it's what kept them sane, what kept them fighting. Helena's finger tightened on the device's trigger. One shock will drop her again. I can modify the settings to cause permanent damage. Stop this now or your daughter becomes a vegetable. The threat hung in the air like surgical smoke. Marcus felt the familiar paralysis creeping up his spine, the same hesitation that had cost lives in his operating room, that had left him frozen while patients slipped away. Every instinct screamed at him to negotiate, to find a safer path, to avoid the risk of losing Sarah again. But Sarah herself made the choice. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held 3 years of pain and survival. And in that gaze he saw forgiveness for every failure, understanding for every moment of weakness. His daughter, who had trusted him to save Bella and lost everything when he failed. His daughter, who had endured unspeakable transformation and still possessed enough love to lead him here. She was giving him permission to be brave. Marcus lunged forward as Helena raised the device. His shoulder caught her in the midsection, driving her backward against the surgical table. The electrical weapon flew from her hands, clattering across the concrete as they struggled. Helena was smaller but desperate, her fingernails clawing at his face as she fought with the fury of cornered madness. "You don't understand," she gasped as Marcus pinned her arms. "The research, the applications, we could eliminate death itself. Genetic diseases, aging, the boundaries between species. By torturing children?" Marcus's voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "By stealing my daughter and turning her into your personal experiment?" She was dying anyway. The car accident, internal injuries, brain trauma that would have left her a vegetable. "I saved her, Marcus. I gave her immortality. You gave her 3 years of hell." The hybrids had surrounded them now, forming a silent circle that pulsed with barely contained violence. But they didn't attack. They waited, watching, letting Marcus choose how this ended. Even in their transformed state, they understood justice better than the woman who had created them. Helena's struggles weakened as the reality of her situation sank in. Her life's work reduced to a circle of victims demanding accountability. The brilliant scientist who had conquered death itself was about to discover that some debts could only be paid in kind. "What happens now?" she whispered. Marcus looked at Sarah, at the dozen other children Helena had stolen and broken and remade. The answer wasn't his to give. It belonged to them. Sarah's response was swift and merciless. Her claws found Helena's throat before Marcus could react. 3 years of suppressed rage channeling into surgical precision. The woman who had preached about eliminating weakness discovered her own in the most fundamental way, the soft vulnerability of human flesh beneath transformed talons. Marcus lunged forward. "Sarah, no!" But his daughter's golden eyes held no recognition, only the feral satisfaction of justice finally delivered. Helena's body convulsed once, then went still. The brilliant scientist who had conquered death lay broken on her own laboratory floor, her pale blue eyes staring sightlessly at the surgical lights she'd used to illuminate so much suffering. The other hybrids released a collective sound, part howl, part sigh, that spoke of burdens finally lifted. But Marcus felt only horror expanding in his chest like a surgical incision gone wrong. This wasn't justice. This was his daughter becoming the monster Helena had tried to create. "What have you done?" he whispered, reaching towards Sarah's blood-stained claws. She recoiled from his touch, her hybrid form suddenly alien and unknowable. The intelligence in her eyes remained, but it was cold now, calculating. she looked at Helena's corpse with the same clinical detachment their former mentor had shown her victims. Then Sarah turned and walked away. The other hybrids followed without hesitation, their mismatched forms disappearing into the corridor shadows like nightmares returning to sleep. Within moments, Marcus was alone with Helena's body and the weight of his catastrophic failure. He had come here to save his daughter. Instead, he'd watched her complete the very transformation he'd hoped to reverse. The girl who had once cried over injured butterflies had just committed murder without remorse, and his presence had somehow made it possible. Marcus sank to his knees beside Helena's corpse, his hands shaking as the adrenaline drained away. 3 years of imagining Sarah's rescue had never included this scenario, his daughter walking away from him by choice, choosing her transformed family over the father who had failed to protect her in the first place. The facility's emergency lighting flickered, casting dancing shadows across blood-slicked concrete. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped with metronomic persistence, marking time that Marcus no longer knew how to measure. How long did he sit there? Minutes? Hours? The distinction seemed meaningless in this place where Helena had dissolved the boundaries between life and death, human and animal, salvation and damnation. When he finally stood, his legs were stiff with cold, and his veterinary mind was cataloguing evidence with automatic precision. Helena's wounds were consistent with large predator attacks. The facility would flood completely when the storm surge peaked. By morning, this would be another tragic accident, a reclusive researcher caught by rising waters in her isolated laboratory. No one would look for the hybrids. No one would question Sarah's official death certificate. The world would never know that humanity's boundaries had been breached and abandoned in the Oregon wilderness. Marcus made his way through the corridors he'd navigated with such desperate hope hours earlier. The cages that had held decomposing dogs stood empty now, their occupants long since disposed of by Helena's methodical madness. But the surgical equipment remained, gleaming instruments that bore the modifications of his own techniques turned to monstrous purpose. His life's work, perverted beyond recognition. Sarah's work, completed with surgical precision. The stairs seemed endless, each step carrying him further from the daughter he'd lost twice now, first to Helena's false death, then to his own failure to reach her in time. When he finally emerged into the storm, the rain felt like absolution he hadn't earned. His truck sat where he'd left it, engine ticking softly as it cooled. The keys were still in his pocket, his wallet still held his license, his phone still carried 3 missed calls from his assistant, wondering why he'd missed his afternoon appointments. The ordinary world persisted, indifferent to the fact that everything fundamental had changed. Marcus drove through the storm-lashed darkness with Helena's blood still under his fingernails and his daughter's cold eyes burned into his memory. The radio chattered about flood warnings and evacuation orders, but he barely heard it. His mind was trapped in that moment when Sarah had chosen violence over reunion, justice over love. He had thought finding her would be enough. He had believed love could survive any transformation, bridge any distance. Instead, he discovered that some boundaries, once crossed, could never be recrossed. Some debts demanded payment in currency that left the payer bankrupt. The Blackwood Research Facility disappeared behind him, swallowed by rain and darkness. But Marcus knew he would never truly leave it. Just as he carried Bella's death in his surgical hands, he would carry Sarah's choice in his heart, the moment his daughter looked at him and walked away, choosing her transformed family over the father who had arrived 3 years too late. The storm raged on, washing away evidence and hope in equal measure. The miles passed in a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and failing streetlights. Marcus drove on autopilot, his veterinary clinic's familiar parking lot materializing before him like a mirage. He sat in his truck for long minutes, engine cooling, watching water cascade down the windshield in patterns that reminded him of tears he could no longer shed. Inside, the clinic felt like a museum of his former life. The examination tables where he'd spent 30 years healing instead of harming. The surgical suite where his hands had saved thousands of lives, before Helena perverted his techniques into instruments of transformation. The weight of normalcy pressed against him like a physical force. His hands moved without conscious thought, pulling files from cabinets, spreading Sarah's veterinary records across his desk alongside Bella's final chart. 2 deaths that had shaped his existence. One real, one fabricated. But as he studied the documents under his desk lamp, patterns emerged that made his breath catch in his throat. Sarah's accident had occurred 3 days after he'd published his breakthrough paper on neural pathway reconstruction in spinal injuries. Helena had called to congratulate him that very morning, her voice warm with pride and something else he'd been too naive to recognize. Hunger. Bella's surgery had failed because of an arterial anomaly Marcus had never encountered before, the same anomaly detailed in Helena's research notes on vascular modification, notes dated 6 months before Bella's death. The realization hit him like surgical steel piercing vital organs. Helena hadn't just stolen his techniques, she'd orchestrated his failures. Bella's death hadn't been his incompetence. It had been sabotage, designed to break him psychologically, to make him question his abilities. And Sarah's accident hadn't been random tragedy. It had been calculated acquisition of the perfect test subject, his own daughter, someone who would trust her father's surgical skills even in transformed form. Marcus's hands shook as he reached for his phone, scrolling through old messages, call logs, appointments. The pattern was undeniable once he knew to look for it. Helena's increased interest in his work. Her suggestions about which conferences to attend, which papers to publish, her recommendations for the experimental anesthetic that had caused Bella's complications. She'd been orchestrating his life for years, positioning him as the unwitting architect of her research, while systematically destroying everything he loved. Every surgical failure, every moment of self-doubt, every sleepless night questioning his competence, all of it had been Helena's design, sculpting him into the broken instrument she needed. The grief he'd carried for 3 years transformed into something else entirely. Not rage. That would have been too simple. This was the cold precision he'd felt in Helena's laboratory, but turned inward, self-examination conducted with surgical honesty. He had come to the facility believing he was Sarah's savior. Instead, he'd been Helena's final pawn, delivering himself to witness his daughter's transformation and his mentor's ultimate triumph. Every choice he'd made had been anticipated, manipulated, orchestrated. Even Sarah's violence might have been calculated, the last psychological wound Helena could inflict before her own death. Marcus stood and walked to his surgical suite, turning on the bright lights that had illuminated so many procedures. His hands, these hands that Helena had used to perfect techniques of transformation, moved with automatic precision as he laid out instruments on the steel table. Scalpels, forceps, surgical thread. Tools of healing and harming, depending on the surgeon's intent. In the autoclave's reflection, he saw what Helena had created. Not just the hybrids in her laboratory, but him, Marcus Whitmore, the grieving father whose guilt made him the perfect unwitting collaborator. She'd spent years studying him as thoroughly as any test subject, mapping his psychological vulnerabilities with the same precision she'd applied to genetic modification. But Helena had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that discovering the truth would destroy him completely, that seeing Sarah choose violence would break whatever remained of his spirit. Instead, it had shown him something else entirely. Sarah hadn't walked away from him in the laboratory. She'd walked away from Helena's vision of what she should become. The daughter who had once organized tea parties for broken toys had found new ways to create family among the damaged, and when justice demanded payment, she delivered it herself rather than ask her father to bear that burden. Helena's greatest failure wasn't her death. It was her inability to recognize that love could adapt to any transformation, survive any horror, transcend any boundary. Sarah had protected him by leaving, sparing him from witnessing what she'd become while ensuring he could never be complicit in what she might do next. Marcus turned off the surgical lights and locked the clinic behind him. Tomorrow, he would call the authorities about flooding at the Blackwood facility. He would express appropriate shock at Helena's tragic death. He would continue treating injured animals with hands that finally understood the difference between healing and harm. But tonight, He drove home carrying not just grief, but terrible clarity. Helena's manipulation had shaped him into the perfect victim. Now it was his choice what to become instead. The rain had stopped by the time Marcus reached his house, leaving the world washed clean under a star-scattered sky that seemed impossibly bright after the storm's fury. He sat in his driveway for several minutes, staring at the modest two-story home where Sarah had grown up, where her bedroom still waited unchanged behind a door he hadn't opened in 3 years. Tonight, he would open it. Inside, Marcus moved through rooms that suddenly felt foreign, despite 30 years of familiarity. The living room where Sarah had built blanket forts. The kitchen where she'd insisted on helping him make pancakes every Sunday morning, creating more mess than food. The hallway lined with photographs that had become shrines to memory rather than celebrations of life. He paused at the bottom of the staircase, his hand gripping the banister Helena had once leaned against during dinner parties, offering insights about veterinary techniques while secretly cataloguing his weaknesses. How many times had she stood in this very spot, studying him like a specimen, planning the precise sequence of tragedies that would make him useful. The anger that thought triggered was clean and sharp, different from the self-directed guilt he'd carried for years. This was surgical anger, purposeful and precise. Helena was beyond his reach now, but her work remained. Somewhere in the Oregon wilderness, Sarah led a pack of transformed children who possessed intelligence, communication skills, and 3 years of accumulated rage against a world that had forgotten them. They would need help, not rescue. Sarah had made that choice clear, but resources, medical supplies, safe passage. Someone who understood both their human hearts and their transformed bodies. Marcus climbed the stairs with steady steps, each footfall marking his transition from victim to ally. Sarah's door opened easily, revealing a room frozen in teenage amber. Veterinary textbooks stacked beside young adult novels, posters of endangered species sharing wall space with boy band photographs, the careful chaos of a 17-year-old who dreamed of following her father into healing but had been diverted into nightmare instead. He sat on her bed and pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number he needed. Dr. James Reeves, his former colleague from veterinary school, now working with wildlife rehabilitation in remote locations. A man who asked few questions and understood that sometimes healing required operating outside official channels. "James, it's Marcus Whitmore." He kept his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to request. "I need to discuss a consulting arrangement. Specialized care for unique cases." The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Marcus spoke carefully, describing symptoms that could belong to rare genetic conditions, requesting supplies that could treat everything from infected wounds to dietary deficiencies in unusual metabolisms. James listened with the professional curiosity of someone accustomed to wildlife emergencies, agreeing to establish a supply drop system at coordinates Marcus provided. When the call ended, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of planning rather than reacting. Helena had taught him to see himself as helpless, but 30 years of veterinary practice had actually prepared him for this moment. He knew how to treat traumatic injuries. He understood nutritional requirements for rapid healing. He could provide the medical support Sarah's pack needed without demanding the emotional reconciliation she wasn't ready to offer. The next call was to his clinic's pharmaceutical supplier. Emergency orders weren't unusual in rural veterinary practice, and his reputation for treating wildlife rescue cases provided perfect cover. Antibiotics, surgical supplies, specialized nutrition supplements, everything a pack of hybrid creatures might require to survive in the wilderness. By dawn, Marcus had transformed his home office into a coordination center. Maps of the Oregon wilderness marked with potential shelter locations, lists of supplies organized by priority and delivery schedule, contact information for discrete suppliers who specialized in unusual cases. He paused to study a photograph on his desk, Sarah, at 15, grinning beside the abandoned puppy she'd convinced him to treat, despite its hopeless condition. That puppy had survived and thrived, becoming a beloved family pet for 3 years before cancer finally claimed it. Sarah had cried at its peaceful death, but expressed gratitude for the extra time they'd shared. She'd been learning even then that love sometimes meant letting go on someone else's terms. Marcus understood now that his role had fundamentally changed. He wasn't Sarah's father trying to bring her home. He was a medical professional supporting patients who happened to include his transformed daughter. The distinction mattered. It allowed him to channel his grief into purpose, his guilt into action, his love into the kind of practical support that might actually help, rather than hinder. The morning sun streamed through Sarah's bedroom windows as Marcus finalized his plans. Tomorrow, he would begin establishing supply caches in the wilderness coordinates James had provided. He would monitor local missing person reports for other potential victims of Helena's research. He would use his veterinary network to identify safe spaces where hybrid creatures might find sanctuary. Helena had manipulated him into becoming the perfect victim. But her death had freed him to become something far more dangerous to her legacy, a protector of her surviving victims, armed with medical knowledge and 30 years of experience healing the damaged. The war against Helena's vision was just beginning. 3 weeks into his new existence as a guardian for the transformed, Marcus discovered that good intentions carried their own devastating consequences. The first supply drop had gone smoothly. James's wilderness coordinates led to a natural cave system where Marcus left medical supplies, high-protein emergency rations, and waterproof containers of antibiotics. When he returned a week later, everything was gone, along with fresh scratches on nearby trees that formed what looked almost like letters. SAFE, carved in bark by claws that had once been fingers. The second drop had been compromised. Marcus arrived at the designated clearing to find his carefully packed supplies scattered across the forest floor, torn packages, bleeding medical gauze, and crushed pills into the rain-soaked earth. Tire tracks in the mud told the story. Someone else had been watching, waiting, learning his patterns. Hidden in the tree line, a figure emerged that made Marcus's blood freeze in recognition. Dr. Richard Voss, Helena's former research partner, very much alive despite the explosion that had supposedly claimed him along with the facility's records 3 years ago. "Hello, Marcus." Voss's voice carried the same clinical detachment Marcus remembered from medical conferences, as if they were discussing case studies instead of standing over destroyed supplies meant for hybrid survivors. "Helena told me you'd eventually become useful. She just didn't specify how." The conversation that followed stripped away any illusion that Helena's death had ended her research. Voss had been working from a secondary facility, monitoring Marcus's activities through surveillance equipment planted in his clinic during routine maintenance visits. Every supply order, every coordinate, every attempt to help Sarah's pack had been observed and catalogued. "You've made our work so much easier," Voss explained, with the satisfaction of a researcher whose hypothesis had been confirmed. "We lost track of the escaped specimens after the flood, but you led us straight to their territory. Helena always said your paternal instincts would be your weakness." Marcus realized with sickening clarity that he'd become Helena's instrument of destruction, even after her death. Every attempt to help had provided intelligence to her successor. Every supply drop had mapped Sarah's movements for hunters who understood exactly how to exploit hybrid vulnerabilities. The weight of his failure crushed down like surgical equipment collapsing. He'd thought himself free of manipulation, finally acting with purpose and agency. Instead, he'd been performing Helena's final experiment, testing whether love could be weaponized against its own object. Voss departed with coordinates to 3 more supply locations Marcus had established, leaving him alone among the scattered remains of his careful plans. But as Marcus knelt in the mud, gathering ruined medical supplies with hands that shook with more than cold, he felt something unexpected rising in his chest. Not despair, not the familiar self-directed guilt that had paralyzed him for 3 years. This was the same cold precision he'd experienced watching Sarah deliver justice to Helena, but turned outward with surgical focus. Voss had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed Marcus would collapse under the weight of renewed manipulation, would retreat into helpless grief like the broken veterinarian Helena had cultivated. Instead, he'd revealed the scope of his operation, his methods, his timeline. Marcus stood slowly, his veterinary mind cataloging facts with deadly precision. Voss needed live specimens for his research, which meant Sarah's pack remained temporarily safe. The surveillance equipment in his clinic could be turned into a weapon if he controlled the information it transmitted. And Helena's research had always depended on one fundamental weakness: the assumption that love made people predictable. Walking back to his truck, Marcus began planning with the methodical thoroughness he'd once applied to complex surgeries. Voss expected him to continue the supply drops, growing more desperate and careless with each failed attempt. He could use those expectations, feed carefully crafted intelligence that would lead Voss into traps instead of toward his targets. The drive home felt different this time, not like retreat, but like tactical withdrawal. Marcus understood now that this war wouldn't be won through good intentions or passive support. Helena had trained him to think like prey, but Sarah had shown him how predators moved, with purpose, patience, and absolute commitment to protecting their pack. By the time Marcus reached his clinic, he'd identified 17 ways to turn his surveillance equipment against its operators. His pharmaceutical connections could provide substances that appeared medical but served very different purposes. His reputation for eccentric wildlife care would provide perfect cover for acquiring the specialized equipment Voss would never see coming. Helena had spent years molding him into the perfect victim, but her greatest miscalculation was believing that victims couldn't evolve into something far more dangerous, a protector who understood exactly how predators thought, because he'd been systematically hunted by the best. The final confrontation with Voss was no longer a distant possibility. It was an appointment Marcus intended to keep. Armed with 30 years of surgical precision and 3 years of accumulated rage finally given proper direction, this time he wouldn't be anyone's instrument but his own. Marcus spent the next 48 hours transforming his clinic into a weapon disguised as a veterinary practice. The surveillance equipment Voss had planted became the foundation for an elaborate deception, each device feeding carefully orchestrated misinformation designed to draw his hunters into positions of maximum vulnerability. The plan required precision that made his most delicate surgeries seem crude by comparison. Marcus began by altering his supply orders, requesting materials that would appear to indicate increased hybrid pack activity in locations far from Sarah's actual territory. Emergency antibiotics suggested infected wounds. Large quantities of specialized nutrition supplements implied a growing population. Orders for tranquilizers and restraints painted him as someone preparing for capture operations. Every phone call was performed for his hidden audience. Each conversation crafted to build a narrative Voss would find irresistible. Marcus spoke with James about concerning aggressive behavior in his unusual wildlife cases, describing symptoms that suggested the hybrids were becoming dangerous, desperate, easier targets. He scheduled supply drops at coordinates that would funnel Voss's team into a box canyon 30 miles from Sarah's actual location, a geological trap with only one exit. The pharmaceutical components arrived within days, Marcus's reputation for emergency wildlife care ensuring rapid delivery without questions. But these weren't healing supplies. Concentrated sedatives that could be weaponized through dispersal systems, industrial-grade tranquilizers potent enough to drop a grizzly bear, chemical compounds that appeared medical but became paralytic agents when combined correctly. His veterinary training, twisted through Helena's manipulation into an instrument of transformation, now served a different purpose entirely. Marcus understood anatomy with surgical precision, not just where to heal, but where to harm. 30 years of treating animals had taught him exactly how much chemical intervention any nervous system could survive. Working through the night, Marcus retrofitted his clinic's ventilation system with modifications that would be invisible to casual inspection, but could flood the building with aerosolized compounds on command. Motion sensors designed for wildlife monitoring became triggers for chemical deployment. Medical equipment that had once saved lives was recalibrated to ensure Voss's team would find something far different than the broken veterinarian they expected. The hardest part was maintaining his performance as Helena's perpetual victim. During supply runs to the canyon coordinates, Marcus forced his shoulders to carry defeated weight, Let exhaustion show in his movements, provided the visual confirmation Voss needed to believe his psychological profile remained accurate. Every gesture had to communicate the desperate father whose love had been successfully weaponized against itself. But alone in his clinic after hours, Marcus moved with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for the most critical operation of his career. He practiced chemical mixture protocols until he could prepare paralytic compounds by touch alone. He memorized every sight line, every entry point, every tactical advantage his familiar territory provided. Most importantly, he identified the exact sequence of actions that would neutralize Voss's S-team without creating the kind of evidence that would bring unwanted official attention. The breakthrough came on the fourth night, when Marcus received the coded message he'd been expecting. James called with a report of unusual animal behavior near the canyon coordinates, the signal that reconnaissance teams had been spotted in the area. Voss had taken the bait, positioning his hunters exactly where Marcus needed them. "I think we're dealing with a pack that's become territorial," Marcus told James, knowing every word was being recorded by surveillance devices. "I'm going to need stronger intervention methods. The situation is becoming uncontainable." After ending the call, Marcus sat in Sarah's childhood bedroom, staring at photographs that no longer felt like memorials, but like reminders of what he was fighting to protect. Helena had taught him to think like prey, conditioned him to accept victimhood as his natural state, but her research had also given him something else, intimate knowledge of how predators hunted, what they expected from their quarry, how their confidence could become fatal overreach. Tomorrow, Voss would come to the clinic expecting to find a broken veterinarian ready to be molded into his next unwitting instrument. Instead, he would discover what Helena had never understood about love, that it could evolve beyond recognition while remaining absolutely unchanged at its core. Marcus checked his equipment one final time, ensuring every system was calibrated for maximum efficiency. The chemical compounds were properly mixed and loaded, the dispersal mechanisms tested and armed, the clinic transformed from a place of healing into a trap designed with 3 years of accumulated rage and 30 years of medical precision. Helena had created him to be the perfect victim. Now he would show her successor exactly what happened when victims stopped accepting their assigned roles and started writing their own endings. The final test was about to begin, and Marcus intended to ensure only one side survived to apply its lessons. The knock came at precisely 9:47 a.m., 3 sharp raps that echoed through the clinic with the mechanical precision Marcus had expected. Through the security monitor, he watched Dr. Richard Voss approach the entrance flanked by 2 men whose movements carried the careful alertness of military contractors. Everything about their positioning screamed tactical awareness, except for their complete blindness to the trap they were entering. Marcus opened the door with hands that trembled just enough to sell his performance. "Richard, I wasn't expecting—" "Of course you weren't." Voss stepped inside without invitation, his eyes scanning the familiar clinic environment with predatory satisfaction. "But circumstances have evolved beyond your limited understanding, Marcus. Helena always said you'd require direct supervision eventually." The 2 contractors followed, their attention focused on potential threats from hybrid creatures rather than the veterinary equipment humming quietly around them. Marcus noted their positions, calculated angles and dispersal patterns, felt the weight of the remote trigger in his pocket, like a surgeon's most essential tool. "I don't understand what you want from me," Marcus said, letting defeat color his voice even as he guided them deeper into the clinic's main treatment area. Every step brought them further from the exit, closer to the optimal concentration zone his modifications had created. "You've been feeding us excellent intelligence," Voss replied, settling into the chair Marcus indicated while his men positioned themselves by the windows. "Your emotional attachment to the escaped specimens has provided tracking data we couldn't have obtained through conventional surveillance. But now we need something more active from you." Marcus felt surgical precision focusing his thoughts as Voss outlined the next phase. Live capture operations. Marcus's veterinary skills used to keep hybrid specimens viable during transport. his emotional connection to Sarah exploited to ensure her cooperation during the transformation reversals that would provide data for Helena's ultimate research goals. "She's still alive," Marcus whispered, the question emerging with genuine anguish that served his performance perfectly. "Very much so, along with 17 other successful specimens." Voss's smile carried Helena's clinical satisfaction. "Your daughter has become quite the pack leader, actually. Remarkable adaptation to her new physiology. Helena would be proud of how well her surgical techniques integrated with your paternal conditioning." The words hit like scalpel cuts, each revelation designed to break down Marcus's resistance through precisely applied emotional trauma. But instead of the collapse Voss expected, Marcus felt something cold and surgical clicking into place behind his eyes. The same focus that had guided him through thousands of life-saving procedures, now calibrated for a very different kind of intervention. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Marcus asked, his hand drifting toward the remote trigger with the unconscious precision of 30 years reaching for surgical instruments. "Tomorrow night, you'll make contact with your daughter's pack using protocols we've developed." Voss leaned forward, confidence making him careless. "Your emotional bond should overcome their natural wariness of human contact. Once you've gained access to their shelter, our teams will move in for collection." Marcus nodded slowly, letting understanding dawn across his features like a man finally accepting his powerlessness. "And if I refuse?" "You won't." Voss's certainty carried Helena's absolute faith in her psychological manipulations. "Because refusal means we'll simply hunt them down through conventional methods. More traumatic for the specimens, much higher mortality rates. But your cooperation ensures they survive the collection process intact." The familiar weight of impossible choices settled over Marcus like surgical drapes. Every option designed to serve Helena's research, regardless of which path he chose. Voss watched his internal struggle with the satisfaction of a researcher observing predicted behavior patterns, completely blind to the tactical assessment occurring behind Marcus's expression of anguish. "I need time to think," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying exactly the right note of broken resistance. "Of course. 24 hours should be sufficient for acceptance to set in." Voss stood, gesturing for his men to prepare for departure. "We'll return tomorrow evening for your decision. I trust you'll reach the correct conclusion." As they moved toward the exit, Marcus felt the moment crystallizing with surgical clarity. 3 targets in optimal position, dispersal system armed and ready, chemical compounds mixed to precise specifications that would ensure rapid nervous system shutdown without permanent damage. He wasn't Helena, wouldn't become a killer regardless of provocation. But as his finger found the remote trigger, Marcus hesitated. Not from doubt about his course of action, but from a sudden understanding that this confrontation was exactly what Helena had engineered. Even in death, she was orchestrating events, using Voss as her instrument to transform Marcus into something he'd never chosen to become. The realization should have paralyzed him with familiar self-doubt. Instead, it brought perfect clarity. Helena's manipulations only had power if he accepted her definitions of victory and defeat. But there were other ways to win this war, ways that honored what Sarah had become rather than what Helena had stolen. Marcus's hand moved away from the trigger as Voss reached the door. Not from weakness, but from a strength Helena had never anticipated, the ability to choose love over vengeance, even when vengeance felt perfectly justified. 24 hours, he told Voss quietly. 24 hours, Voss confirmed, completely unaware that he'd just walked out of the perfect trap and into something far more dangerous than any chemical weapon Marcus could have deployed. The clinic fell silent except for the hum of equipment that had been converted from instruments of healing into weapons Marcus would never deploy. He stood in the empty treatment room, staring at the remote trigger in his palm like a surgeon contemplating an amputation that would save the patient, but destroy everything that made life worth living. 23 hours and 47 minutes until Voss returned. Time enough to activate every trap he'd so carefully prepared, to turn his clinic into a killing ground that would eliminate the immediate threat to Sarah's pack. But victory through violence would complete Helena's final transformation of him, From healer to killer, love weaponized into its own destruction. Marcus walked to his office, past surveillance equipment that had become meaningless now that the real battle lines were drawn. In Sarah's photograph, her 12-year-old smile seemed to ask the question he'd been avoiding. What price was he willing to pay to protect what she'd become? The answer crystallized with surgical precision: everything, but not in the way Helena had programmed him to sacrifice. Marcus began dismantling his chemical weapons with the same methodical care he'd used to construct them. Each compound was neutralized and disposed of safely, every trap disabled, all evidence of his planned violence erased. By dawn, his clinic had returned to its original purpose, a place dedicated to preserving life rather than ending it. But his surrender of vengeance was only the first sacrifice the coming victory would demand. At 7 a.m., Marcus drove to the coordinates where he'd last seen Sarah's pack. The forest clearing showed signs of recent habitation, disturbed earth, faint scent markers his veterinary training helped him identify. But the hybrids had moved on, their survival instincts keeping them ahead of the hunters Voss would inevitably deploy. Finding them required abandoning the last pretense of his normal life. Marcus left his truck at the forest edge and proceeded on foot, following tracks and signs that demanded every skill he'd developed treating wild animals over 3 decades. His pursuit led deeper into the Oregon wilderness than any conventional search could reach, through terrain where his age and physical limitations made every mile a struggle. By the 3rd day, his supplies were exhausted and his body pushed beyond safe limits. But Marcus continued tracking, driven by the understanding that this might be his final opportunity to see his daughter before Voss's deadline forced impossible choices. He found them at sunset on the 4th day. Sarah's pack denned in a cave system hidden behind a waterfall, their hybrid senses having detected his approach hours before he stumbled into their sanctuary. 7 creatures that had once been human watched him from the shadows, their transformed bodies magnificent and terrible in the dying light. Sarah emerged last, her canine features more pronounced than when he'd seen her in Helena's laboratory adaptation, continuing to reshape her into something unprecedented. But her eyes remained achingly familiar, holding recognition that made Marcus's heart break with joy and grief simultaneously. She approached slowly, her pack maintaining protective positions that spoke to her leadership role among the survivors. When she finally stood before him, Marcus saw the question in her transformed features. Why had he come? "Voss is going to use me to find you," Marcus said quietly, his words carrying across the clearing to listening ears both human and canine. "He believes I can't resist helping you, that my love makes me predictable." Sarah tilted her head, the gesture purely canine but somehow conveying perfect understanding. "He's right," Marcus continued, tears streaming down his face as the magnitude of his necessary sacrifice became clear. "I can't resist helping you, but not the way he expects." Marcus pulled out his cell phone, the tracking device Voss was undoubtedly monitoring, and set it carefully on the ground between them. Then he reached into his jacket and withdrew the emergency medical kit he'd carried throughout his search, placing it beside the phone like an offering. "I can't go back," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of what he was choosing. "If I return to the clinic, I become his instrument whether I cooperate or resist, but if I disappear—" Understanding dawned in Sarah's transformed features. If Marcus vanished without a trace, Voss would lose his primary psychological weapon. The emotional leverage that made Marcus predictable would become a liability, a missing person investigation that could expose operations that required absolute secrecy. More importantly, Marcus's disappearance would force Voss to hunt the hybrids through conventional methods that gave Sarah's pack every advantage their enhanced senses and intelligence could provide. Sarah stepped forward and pressed her transformed face against his shoulder, in a gesture that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, parent and child. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel the warmth of connection he'd mourned as lost forever. Then she stepped back, picked up his phone, and threw it into the rushing water below the falls. His last link to the human world disappeared into the darkness, carrying with it the veterinarian Marcus Whitmore had been. What remained was a father who had finally learned the true cost of love. Sometimes saving what mattered most required sacrificing everything else, including yourself. The sound of the phone disappearing into the rushing water below marked the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Marcus stood in the gathering darkness, watching the last bubbles rise to the surface where his connection to the human world had vanished forever. No clinic to return to, no identity to reclaim, no path back to the man he'd been before Helena's final manipulation had stripped away everything except the love that had brought him to this moment. Sarah moved first, her pack following as she led them deeper into the cave system behind the waterfall. Marcus understood the invitation without words. They were offering him sanctuary, but it would come at the cost of everything familiar. He followed them into the darkness, his human eyes struggling to navigate passages where their enhanced senses moved with perfect confidence. The cave network extended far beyond what he'd imagined, natural chambers connected by tunnels that spoke to geological formations carved over millennia. The pack had chosen their refuge well. Dozens of escape routes, water sources, elevated positions that would give them tactical advantages against any conventional assault. Helena's experiments had created not just physical hybrids, but beings whose combined human intelligence and animal instincts made them nearly impossible to hunt using traditional methods. In the deepest chamber, lit by chemical lights the pack had somehow acquired, Marcus saw the full scope of what they'd built. Medical supplies arranged with careful precision, maps marking safe routes and resource locations, communications equipment modified for their specific needs. Sarah hadn't just led survivors, she'd created a functioning society adapted to their transformed existence. But it was the smaller details that broke his heart with pride and grief. Photographs rescued from their human lives, arranged like shrines to who they'd been. Personal items that retained emotional significance despite their altered circumstances. The pack had refused to surrender their humanity, even as their bodies forced adaptation to something beyond traditional categories. Sarah approached him carrying a bundle of supplies, clothing sized for his frame, water purification tablets, emergency rations, the practical necessities of survival, offered without ceremony, but with the understanding that his choice to disappear meant accepting dependence on their knowledge and resources. The veterinarian, who had once treated their injuries, would now need their protection to survive in the wilderness they'd made their home. Over the following hours, other pack members gradually accepted his presence. Marcus recognized surgical scars on several of them, evidence of Helena's experiments but also of his own veterinary techniques used in ways he'd never intended. They studied him with eyes that held too much intelligence for their transformed features, evaluating the human who had sacrificed his former life to protect their freedom. When dawn filtered through hidden openings in the cave system, Marcus understood that Voss would be discovering his absence. The clinic empty, his truck abandoned at the forest edge, no response to communication attempts. By evening, when the deadline arrived, Voss would face a choice between exposing his operations through official searches or accepting that his primary psychological weapon had neutralized itself. Sarah found him sitting at the cave entrance as morning light revealed the vast wilderness that would be his new home. She carried something in her transformed hands, a small device that took him several moments to recognize. A radio transponder, military grade, the kind Voss's teams would use to coordinate hunting operations. Understanding hit him like surgical precision cutting through confusion. The pack wasn't just hiding from their hunters, they were monitoring them. Sarah's intelligence network had been gathering tactical information, while Voss believed he held all the advantages. Marcus's disappearance wouldn't just eliminate their psychological leverage, it would force them to operate blind against enemies who had been watching their every move. For the first time since discovering Sarah's transformation, Marcus felt something approaching hope. Helena's experiments had stolen their human bodies, but they'd gained capabilities she'd never anticipated. Enhanced senses that made them impossible to surprise. Intelligence that let them turn conventional hunting tactics into disadvantages. Most importantly, the pack bonds that gave them strength Helena's individualistic worldview couldn't comprehend. Sarah activated the transponder, and Voss's voice crackled through static. Search teams report no contact at the primary location. Subject Whitmore's vehicle abandoned, no signs of struggle. Recommend expanding perimeter and initiating recovery protocols. Marcus listened to his former captors struggling to adapt to circumstances they'd never prepared for, their confidence cracking as their carefully laid psychological traps became liabilities. Voss had built his entire strategy around Marcus's predictable desperation, never considering that love might choose sacrifice over manipulation. As Sarah turned off the device, Marcus understood that his disappearance was only the beginning of a larger transformation. The pack had spent months learning to survive as Helena's unwilling creations. Now they were evolving into something she'd never envisioned, a community that honored both their lost humanity and their transformed capabilities, strong enough to protect itself and those who chose to stand with them. The veterinarian Marcus Whitmore had died with his phone in the rushing water below the falls. What remained was something new, a father who had finally learned that love's greatest victories sometimes required surrendering everything except love itself. 6 months after the veterinarian Marcus Whitmore officially vanished into the Oregon wilderness, Dr. Helena Vasquez received an anonymous package at the Portland Animal Research Institute. Inside, she found detailed medical files documenting revolutionary surgical techniques for treating hybrid physiology, procedures that seemed to blend veterinary medicine with theoretical xenobiology in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The accompanying note was brief for those who choose healing over harm. A friend. Helena had heard whispers about Dr. Whitmore's disappearance, the theories ranging from suicide to murder to simple midlife crisis. What she hadn't expected was evidence that he might be alive, conducting research that advanced veterinary science in directions that challenged everything she thought she understood about species barriers. The techniques described in the files would revolutionize treatment for animals with severe genetic disorders. More importantly, they suggested the author had direct experience with physiology that existed nowhere in conventional medicine. Helena found herself wondering what kind of patients had taught Dr. Whitmore such unprecedented surgical approaches. 300 miles away, in a cave system that had become both laboratory and home, Marcus carefully sutured the healing surgical site where he'd removed a bone fragment from River's transformed shoulder. The hybrid, formerly Dr. James Chen, a research biochemist, had been injured during their latest supply run, and the surgery had required adapting techniques Marcus had never imagined he'd need to develop. River's recovery was proceeding better than expected, his enhanced healing capabilities responding well to modified protocols that honored both his human intelligence and canine physiology. The pack had learned to assist with medical procedures, their transformed hands capable of surgical precision when necessity demanded it. Sarah had become particularly skilled at suture work, her hybrid senses allowing her to detect infection or complications before conventional instruments could measure them. The Portland delivery was successful, Sarah reported, settling beside him as River's packmates maintained their healing vigil. Helena Vasquez has the reputation and resources to develop our techniques for broader application. Marcus nodded, understanding the careful balance they were striking. The medical knowledge gained from treating the pack's unique physiology was too valuable to hoard, but sharing it required anonymity that protected both their location and their existence. Helena would never know that her revolutionary new surgical protocols had been developed by a missing veterinarian treating patients who officially didn't exist. Over the past months, Marcus had documented 17 different medical procedures adapted specifically for hybrid physiology, techniques for treating dual nervous systems, surgical approaches that accommodated enhanced bone density, drug therapies calibrated for metabolisms that combined human and canine characteristics. Each breakthrough had emerged from necessity as pack members dealt with injuries or complications from their ongoing physical transformation. But the true revolution wasn't medical. It was personal. Marcus had spent 3 years mourning the daughter he'd lost, never understanding that she'd evolved into something beyond his categories of human or animal, living or dead. Now he watched Sarah lead evening discussions where pack members shared memories of their human lives while planning survival strategies that utilized their transformed capabilities. They hadn't simply adapted to their new existence. They'd created a culture that honored both what they'd been and what they'd become. The Marcus, who had once measured success by surgeries completed and animals saved, would barely recognize the man he'd become. His hands, once steady enough to perform microsurgery, now showed calluses from cave construction and wilderness survival. His body, formerly maintained through clinic routines and suburban comfort, had adapted to a physical existence that demanded strength he'd never known he possessed. Most profoundly, his definition of healing had expanded beyond individual patients to encompass protecting an entire community's right to exist. When thunderstorms rolled through the mountains that night, Marcus found himself remembering the storm that had first led him to Sarah 3 years ago. That man had been driven by guilt and professional failure, desperately seeking redemption through fixing what Helena had broken. This man understood that some transformations couldn't be reversed, and didn't need to be. Sarah approached as he sat watching rain cascade past the cave entrance, her movements carrying the fluid grace of perfect adaptation to her transformed body. She no longer resembled the 12-year-old who had trusted him to save her beloved pet, or even the broken hybrid he'd first encountered weeping by the roadside. She had become something unprecedented, a being who had transcended the boundaries between species while retaining the essential humanity that made love possible across any transformation. "Are you ready for tomorrow's expedition?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy familiarity that had replaced their earlier careful navigation of changed relationships. Marcus smiled, understanding that she was asking about more than their planned supply run to establish another research cache. Tomorrow would mark another step in their ongoing evolution, from Helena's unwilling test subjects to architects of their own survival, from victims of unethical experimentation to pioneers of existence beyond conventional categories. "I'm ready," he replied, meaning it completely. The veterinarian, Marcus Whitmore, had died believing love required preserving what was. The man who remained had learned that love's greatest expression sometimes meant embracing what could be, regardless of how impossible it seemed. The new beginning. Thunder still echoed through the mountains when they set out the next morning, but the storm had passed, leaving the forest washed clean and gleaming with possibility. Marcus shouldered his pack, heavier now with medical supplies and research notes destined for another anonymous delivery, and followed Sarah through trails that existed only in the collective memory of the pack. His feet found purchase on wet stones with confidence that still surprised him, his body having adapted to wilderness navigation in ways the suburban veterinarian could never have imagined. They moved in formation that honored both human planning and pack instincts, Sarah leading while River and the others maintained positions that provided security without appearing threatening to any chance human encounters. Marcus had learned to read their silent communications, the subtle shifts in posture that indicated changing wind patterns, the ear positions that signaled potential dangers miles before his limited senses could detect them. He was still fully human, but 6 months of integration had taught him to function as part of something larger than individual survival. The research cache they were establishing today would be the 7th in a network spanning 3 states. Each location contained medical documentation that pushed veterinary science toward applications no conventional researcher would think to explore. Dr. Elena Vasquez had already published papers based on their anonymous contributions, her work helping animals whose genetic disorders had previously been considered untreatable. Soon, other veterinarians would receive similar packages, the knowledge spreading through official channels, while its hybrid origins remained safely hidden. But Marcus understood their mission went beyond advancing medical science. Each cache was a statement of existence, proof that Helena's victims had become something more than the sum of their trauma. They were building a legacy that honored both their lost humanity and their transformed capabilities, ensuring their knowledge would survive regardless of what happened to the pack itself. As they descended toward the drop point, a remote ranger station where their package would be discovered and forwarded to the appropriate recipient, Marcus found himself thinking about the man he'd been a year ago. That broken veterinarian had stumbled through storm and guilt, seeking redemption through impossible repairs to damage he'd never actually caused. The realization that Helena had orchestrated Sarah's death, that his surgical failure had been deliberately engineered, had initially filled him with rage at the deception. Now he felt something closer to gratitude for the journey that deception had ultimately made necessary. Sarah signaled for a halt 50 yards from the station, her enhanced hearing confirming the building was unoccupied. Marcus approached alone, placing the medical package in a location where it would be found but not immediately suspected as an intentional drop. Inside were surgical protocols for treating animals with severe spinal injuries, techniques developed while helping River recover from his damaged shoulder, but applicable to countless conventional patients who might otherwise face euthanasia. When he returned to the pack's position, Sarah was monitoring radio frequencies on equipment they'd acquired through channels Marcus preferred not to examine too closely. Voss's team still conducted periodic sweeps of the region, but their efforts had become increasingly desperate as months passed without meaningful contact. The psychological warfare expert who had built his career on predicting human behavior was learning the limits of conventional tactics against enemies who had transcended conventional categories. "They're pulling teams back to focus on urban areas," Sarah reported, her translation of intercepted communications revealing strategic shifts that confirmed what they'd suspected for weeks. The official search for Dr. Marcus Whitmore had been quietly suspended, filed among the thousands of missing persons cases that annually vanished into statistical anonymity. Voss could no longer justify the resources required to hunt for enemies who might not even exist, whose threat level remained entirely theoretical. The pack began their return journey as afternoon light filtered through evergreen canopies, their route taking them past landmarks that had become meaningful in ways Marcus was still learning to appreciate. The clearing where they'd first successfully treated hybrid injuries using adapted techniques. The ridge where pack members had taught him to navigate by scent and sound when visual navigation failed. Each location held memories of gradual transformation from desperate survivors to something approaching a functioning society. By evening, they were back in the cave system, the familiar sounds of their underground home providing security that no conventional dwelling had ever offered Marcus. Pack members shared the day's observations over a meal prepared with ingredients both hunted and gathered, their conversation flowing between English and the hybrid communication they were collectively developing. Marcus contributed his own intelligence, patterns he'd observed in the medical literature they were anonymously influencing, opportunities for future contributions that could advance treatments for animals whose suffering he'd once felt powerless to address. But it was later, when the others had settled into evening routines, that Marcus found himself truly understanding what their new beginning meant. Sarah approached him carrying something he hadn't seen in months, a photograph from her human childhood, one of the few personal artifacts that had survived their various escapes and relocations. The image showed a 12-year-old girl grinning beside her beloved dog, both of them radiating the unconscious happiness that came from absolute trust in tomorrow's possibilities. Looking at it now, Marcus no longer felt the crushing grief that had once made such memories unbearable. Instead, he saw continuity that transcended physical transformation, the same fierce intelligence in Sarah's current eyes, the same capacity for loyalty that now extended to protecting pack members who had become family in ways blood relationships never required. Sarah set the photograph carefully among the other memorial objects that honored their collective past, then turned to meet Marcus's gaze with eyes that held both profound change and essential recognition. "We're not the same people we were," she said quietly, her words carrying across the cave to listening ears that understood the weight of such acknowledgement. "But we're still us." Marcus nodded, finally comprehending what love looked like when freed from the necessity of preservation. The daughter he'd mourned was gone, but the being who had taken her place carried forward everything that had made that love meaningful. The veterinarian who had failed to save a beloved pet was gone, but the man who remained had learned to heal wounds that conventional medicine never recognized as treatable. Outside their sanctuary, spring rain continued to wash the mountains clean, carrying away the last traces of winter while preparing the forest for whatever growth the coming season might bring. Inside, a pack of beings who had transcended the boundaries between species while retaining everything essential about love settled into sleep, secure in the knowledge that they had built something worth protecting. Dr. Marcus Whitmore had begun his journey believing that love meant preserving what was precious against all forms of change. The man who now closed his eyes in grateful exhaustion understood that love's greatest triumph was learning to recognize what remained precious, regardless of how impossible its transformation might seem. Some new beginnings, he had learned, were worth everything they cost,